Hello and welcome to Greenomics, a podcast from Oxford Economics where we delve into the complex relationship between climate, nature and our global economy. I'm your host, Sarah Nelson, and the Economics and Sustainability team here at Oxford Economics, and together we'll be navigating the changing landscape of the green transition. Each month we'll be joined by a panel of experts to discuss one aspect of sustainability and unpack what it means for businesses in today's economy. As our listeners well know, climate change will dramatically increase the risks of severe climate-related disasters. This umbrella term covers the extreme weather events, ecosystems degradation, sea level rise, and more that will come with higher temperatures later this century. Today we're going to discuss these physical risks. We'll talk about what they are, how they're measured and forecast, and how understanding the risks can help us prepare for the future. Joining me today are Oxford Economics' very own Mark Britton and David Winter. Mark is the Director of City Services, where he has led our work on mapping physical impacts and risks to find geospatial grids. Mark, welcome. Great to have you on.
Hi Sarah, thanks for inviting me onto this show.
Thanks, Mark. We're also joined by David, who is Lead Economist in the Global Climate Services, where he has headed up the efforts to include climate impacts and policies in our macroeconomic forecasting models. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks for having me.
Great. David, I'm actually going to start with you. We're already seeing some of the physical impacts of climate change. You know, there's droughts, there's floods and so on. Which of these risks will become more prevalent or more severe as the climate heats up even more?
So yeah, on my side, I'm very focused on temperatures. So as we know, the planet's warming, average temperatures are rising. But also as average temperature rises, we're seeing higher volatility and incidents of hot weather extremes as well. So, you know, even though the world has only warmed by around 1.2 degrees Celsius on average, in recent years we're seeing in regions such as North America and Europe heat waves that have exceeded historical norms by several degrees. So that's one thing to know. And if we quantify this statistically, these sort of abnormally high heat waves are actually occurring around 11% of the time now. Versus around 0.1% previously. So quite a marked change just in heat conditions overall. It's also worth mentioning that, of course, these events don't only materialize in the form of heat itself, but can also have knock-on secondary effects or events, such as wildfires and droughts. So, for example, the wildfires in Canada recently have burned more than 15 million hectares of land this year. With severe repercussions climatically, socially and economically. And in Europe, we've seen a winter drought that has necessitated water rationing in France and Italy, and it caused food shortages in Spain because of the damages to crop yields. Of course, it's not all restricted to temperatures, as we've seen with the extremely tragic floods in Pakistan, which submerged around a third of the country, and more recently in Libya, which took the lives of more than 10,000 people and have displaced many more. So these events can be linked to a more broadly destabilized climate system where temperature anomalies are the driving factor, but damages can materialize in unpredictable and often catastrophic ways.
Oxford Economics models a climate catastrophe scenario that potentially is more of what you've just described, the catastrophes you've just described. What drives the climate catastrophe scenario?
Yeah, so our climate catastrophe scenario, it's intended to capture the full downside from physical risks, specifically by accounting for these events that occur at the extremes of the distribution. So the work underlying this, which is currently in review for academic publication, is partly a response to the macro literature, which has until now been mostly focused on measuring the impacts of average temperature levels specifically. So in climate catastrophe, we model and estimate the potential economic implications of high emissions and temperature, so roughly 2.2 degrees of global warming by 2050, with the use of a damage function. So a function that sort of quantifies the damages that explicitly accounts for these volatility and extreme events. So on aggregate, the results are pretty sobering. So we see around a 20% loss in potential economic output by 2050. And if we extend this out to the end of the century, around 5 degrees of warming by 2100 leads to economic annihilation, which is consistent with the scientific research on tipping points and mass extinction thresholds. So I think the purpose of this scenario is really to show how much the damage assessment does change when we account for these additional factors to do with volatility and extremes, which is maybe a more holistic way of measuring broader climate change.
So just to check my understanding, you're saying it's not just the increase in temperatures which causes these catastrophic events or damages, but it's also the fluctuations in temperature that happen on a weekly or monthly basis that cause the damages?
Exactly that. So we're focusing on the sort of monthly frequency, partly due to data constraints. So we're taking a global approach. So we want to be able to make similar deductions, across country about these impacts. But yeah, looking at monthly events, so intra-month volatility against historical norms, as well as explicitly quantifying these more extreme events instead of just focusing on changes in the average.
Right. And Mark, I know, sort of turning to the geographical sort of dispersion, I know you've been taking these macro trends that David just described to more local levels, to cities and regions. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the outputs of David's modelling are really interesting and show significant variation across the world in terms of the economic impacts. But we know that different regions are naturally more vulnerable to some physical risks. And understanding those regional differences is really crucial when trying to assess your exposure to risk. And that's particularly true across larger countries. So one of the most obvious examples to illustrate this is hurricanes in the US. So this is the physical risk that causes the most extensive direct damage to the US economy each year. But we know this risk is not evenly spread across the country. Places in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, all of those are much more susceptible to hurricanes. And so the losses there will be much higher. But our approach to kind of modelling multiple risks across all of the locations within those countries means that we can start to compare the overall risk for each location on a like-for-like basis. So we can look at the annual loss from hurricanes in a city in Florida and say whether that's higher or lower than, say, the annual loss from wildfire risks in a city in California. And so we've modelled multiple kind of risks. We've then integrated it into our standard regional models that kind of capture things like the links between places, the population, employment. And the overall kind of disparities between places was huge in this scenario. So continuing with the US example, we have GDP, as David mentioned, was down by about 20% of economic activity by 2050. But the most extreme losses were down by about 50%. So some cities, their GDP would be down 50% relative to our baseline. At the other end of the spectrum, there were kind of cities that barely saw any impact, those that aren't exposed to those particular physical risks. And so they'll be much more resilient. So this really illustrates the importance of looking at the regional results in conjunction with the great work that David's been doing in the macroeconomic impacts. But if you only looked at the kind of national level, you might actually be underestimating your risk and therefore kind of leaving yourself exposed to unexpected financial shocks. But equally, you might overestimate the risk in a particular location if you just use that national level number, and we know that some cities are going to be much more resilient. You might actually miss out on some great kind of viable investment opportunities.
That's really interesting. So somewhere like the US is really important to look at a regional basis, I guess, particularly because in the US everything's so state-based, the governance and so on. And I might be asking you to go out on a limb because I know that a lot of your work is based in the US, but would another country which perhaps doesn't have the infrastructure or the institutions that the US does how would their risk profile compare to the US?
Yeah, so there would be similarities, but the institutional structure wouldn't necessarily be there to support those locations. So in more developing nations where they just don't have the financial power to protect certain cities or regions, we'd see much more kind of damage and much more kind of movement of people and economic activity than perhaps we would see in the US. So in some of those states in the US that are most exposed, whilst small parts of them are now becoming sort of uninsurable, on the whole, people are still moving there. You're not going to get that in these developing markets where people will just be exposed to these risks and face financial ruin if they stay. So the US is kind of different, so are the developed markets, but in developing parts of the world, the risks are probably more prominent, and they don't have the preparedness to actually deal with them.
And again, really important to understand the risks on a regional level, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we've been talking about this climate catastrophe scenario. It's obviously in the name, catastrophic. David, can you put a ballpark likelihood estimate on this scenario?
Yeah, so well, as we've sort of discussed, this scenario is certainly extreme in both its impacts, but also its underlying narratives, in the sense that warming of around 2.2 to 2.3 degrees by 2050 is still deemed to be quite an extreme temperature pathway, all considered. The other thing that I think came up in your discussion with Mark a bit is on the role of sort of adaptation or responding to these damages. So our modelling approach deliberately omits the potential offsetting impacts of climate adaptation, in at least in the macro sort of framework. And that's so that we're able to understand the full downside from physical risk. So, if you remove that layer of adaptation, of course, you're adding, you're kind of reducing the probability of that scenario, because you're seeing what happens if sort of no one responds. So therefore, climate catastrophe is very unlikely, but possible. In terms of producing a specific number, I don't really believe this can be done with much confidence, especially when we're looking at a 25 to 75 year forecast horizon, but ballpark, we're looking at probably 1% probability or less.
That's reassuringly small, thank you, David. So modelling physical risks, as we've been discussing, especially at a highly localised level, is hugely data intensive and hugely modelling intensive. Mark, I know your team has been working with geospatial data and using some pretty innovative methods to understand climate risks and their costs and damages. How are you using geospatial or big data to look at physical risks at a local level?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, the use of big data has completely changed the way that we're able to understand local economies. So I've been working in the field of regional economics for almost 20 years now, and when I started, we were reliant on just traditional regional accounts or census data points, which are often a few years out of date. And that was the best case scenario. There's countries where we didn't have anything. Nowadays, we can address gaps in all of those traditional sources by creating proxies, using kind of near real-time information from these big alternate data sets, such as satellite imagery, remote sensors, and other geolocated data sets like credit card transactions, business registers, mobile phone data tracking, and even things like social media. And the great thing about using these data sets is that they're all kind of globally consistent and available kind of almost everywhere. And so we can produce all of our analysis in countries where those traditional data sets just aren't available. The challenge in kind of using all of this is actually trying to make sense of it. There's so many kind of data sets and data points that we need to understand what's actually relevant and provide it in a digestible format to actually help make more informed decisions. So in the context of kind of using this for climate analysis and physical risks in particular, there's probably a couple of examples that I can talk through. So the first is using very high frequency data sets. So as part of our research, we needed to identify historical periods of when physical events actually happened, so that we could then work out what the economies did during those periods of stress. So in one example, we took historical geospatial layers on precipitation to identify periods of drought. So these data sets comprised of daily data points over multiple decades for every single region in the world. Obviously, processing that was a huge task, and we built models that helped us identify periods of drought. We then were able to look at the regional agricultural output over those periods and create a damage function that kind of linked the duration and severity of those droughts with the economic losses in those regions. We can then use forward-looking climate models that then tell us which regions are susceptible to those droughts in the future and under different temperature pathways. And then using our damage function, we can then quantify the economic impact going forward. Now, some risks like droughts and heat waves can be considered at quite a broad level. But another big data challenge that we had in our research was we know that some risks are very localized. So take, for example, river flooding. We can't simply say that a city or region's economy is vulnerable to flooding because it has a river. We know that some streets and neighbourhoods will be far more at risk. So it's fairly easy to source flood risk maps at quite a granular level. So often we're talking here about 100-metre grid levels. But to understand the economic impact, we needed to have economic activity at that sort of geographic scale, and that's where the big data project came in. So we've estimated GDP at a hyperlocal level by spatially disaggregating those official sources of regional GDP with other geospatial layers, things like nighttime light emissions measured from satellites, building volumes and densities, land use maps, population density maps. All of these things go into our model, and then using things like machine learning techniques, we're able to train our models to turn all of these data sets into credible estimates of economic activity, which we could then test kind of across cities and regions that actually do produce this level of granularity, so that we can reliably say that we know what the economic activity looks like at this level. And understanding that for some of these physical risks is so important because it varies street to street, neighbourhood to neighbourhood. It's really important to understand whether your economic activity is produced in an area that's actually exposed to these types of things.
So you're saying that you can look at pictures from the night sky of where the lights are in a city and say probably most of the economic activity occurs where the lights are brightest, and then map that against a flood risk map to figure out the most impactful areas of floods.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not just looking at it at nighttime. There's a high correlation between night lights and GDP, but also we can have a look at what it looks like in the daytime. So we can actually identify different types of buildings so that we know, okay, that might be emitting a lot of light, but that's, say, an airport, whereas over here would be Canary Wharf, and then you see the kind of the different types of building, and then you can again disaggregate the different sectors of the economy as well. So there's lots of information that we can put into these models to kind of disaggregate GDP, and then yes, you're right, we then overlay it with various different risks that are produced by kind of other institutions. We're not the ones that are forecasting the actual occurrence of floods and other types of risk. We take those from scientists that have decent climate models, and we then, as economists, try and make sense of what that means for the economy. So we overlay their work on top of our estimates of GDP to produce that kind of at-risk layer.
Interesting. It's quite a far cry from, old census data. It must be quite a big task. So you've got the flood risk and you've got the GDP and you overlay them. How do you then translate those two pieces of information into a potential dollar value of damage? Because there's all sorts of probabilities and likelihoods in there. How do you calculate a damage function?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, there's a few kind of components that go into this. So yes, we have the estimates of GDP at that very granular level that give you that kind of dollar value of what's produced in that particular gridded area. We have the risk layers. Now, they typically come in the form of both a probability and a severity. So take flooding, for example. So we will have risk layers that tell us the depth of water in each 100-metre grid cell under different severity of events. So we'll know in a 1 in a 10-year event how deep the water will be in each cell, and again in a 1 in a 100-year. And because we know those events will happen, so 1 in a 10-year event over the next 30 years, there'll be at least 3 of those. 1 in 100, there'll be kind of a chance of 30% chance of that happening over the next 30 years. And so we can then say that the probability of the damage comes and the severity overlaid with the GDP gets us that kind of first step. Now that's all well and good, but there's a couple of other kind of things that have to come into play. So the damage function, which I've kind of mentioned, that we know that, say, the depth of a flood, if it's only a few centimetres, whilst it causes damage, it's likely to be short-lived. Over a metre or so, and we're getting into the territory of buildings having to be demolished. So we've got data that kind of shows us the damage function at different depths of water, and we can then overlay that with what we know from the risk layers. And so that's the third component. Then there's a final one that we also factor in. So when we think about economies, we know that there's different sectors of the economy, and each of those react differently and will be more resilient or less resilient in particular events. So again, in this example of flooding, if a field of crops is flooded, then that could be the output from that entire growing season completely lost. Whereas if you've got a flood that impacts an office building, then often people can work at home, or it might be short-lived and then you go back into the office after a couple of weeks. And then you get kind of another set of sectors as well, so those that require the in-person interaction, so things like retail or hospitality, tourism, and they're kind of in between. So we know that things like agriculture will be severely impacted, the retail will be somewhere in the middle, and then offices generally are more resilient. And we kind of saw that through the pandemic as well. It's kind of a different risk, but some businesses were able to operate without that in-person interaction, whereas others just can't.
That's really interesting. So many different factors to get to that dollar value, I suppose. David, on the topic of that dollar value, I wanted to ask you, I know some of the research that you've been doing to go into the climate catastrophe scenario extends on a controversial paper, which showed that some countries in the northern regions would benefit from climate change in terms of the dollar value of the so-called damage. Where do you sit on that debate?
Yeah, interesting question. So maybe just to contextualize for listeners, so my work's very much focused. So Mark's work does a lot of very rich analysis, understanding the impacts of specific disasters. So what this literature does on the macro side is try and sort of bring it together a bit and see what's happening big picture globally. And so the data sets that we use are very different. Less granular, more global, and getting this more sort of reduced form relationship. So in terms of where I sit, so I guess the difference between our approach and the old approach, firstly, is that they're very much focused on average temperatures, but we additionally account for these events such as volatility and extremes. So methodologically, I prefer our approach because it's sort of accounting for these factors that people really experience as a result of climate change, rather than an average. I'd quite enjoy a 2 degree warmer summer, but maybe not if it's kind of 40, 45 degrees. So yeah, maybe just narrowing this down a bit. I think what really matters here is the time horizon or severity. So these previous approaches that focus on averages, they see these cooler countries that you mentioned, such as Canada and Russia, benefiting almost indefinitely up to 5 degrees of warming over the next century, while our approach suggests that these benefits would accrue. They would stop accruing more at the sort of one degree of warming level. So after that point, the picture becomes quite negative in our analysis as temperature anomalies, volatility extremes build up, and you get these quite negative and nonlinear damages start to kick in. I think linking up the two is very interesting because these older approaches, they can intuit their positive results by saying, in Canada or Russia, a good example with Siberia, as the planet warms, you're probably going to have a lot of unlocked land potential in Siberia. Things start to thaw, you start to use that land for productive output and that kind of thing. But the real questionable component of that is yes, there'll be that initial benefit, but really up to 5 to 6 degrees Celsius, where scientists are saying there's a sort of extinction level event happening. So yeah, in terms of where I sit, I'm definitely more pessimistic about the benefits for Northern Hemisphere countries at these more extreme levels of warming. I'm not against the idea, and our analysis shows indeed that they can still benefit initially from warming, but it's just those benefits are relatively short-lived as those anomalies start to kick in.
Yeah, so not moving to Siberia then?
Not anytime soon.
Okay. So we discussed today that Oxford Economics and so many others are putting all this effort into trying to understand physical risks, where they're going to happen, what they're going to cost. I'd like to just take a step back and ask, and I think there might be an optimistic and perhaps a realistic answer to this question, but David, why do you think people are putting so much effort into forecasting climate risks?
Yeah, so I think, well, hopefully understanding these risks will lead to better preparation and can inform policy response. Of course, you need to understand the nature of something before you can respond to it and prepare to it effectively. But also looking at the risk sort of thing that you mentioned. Climate change is an area of huge uncertainty. As you can see, even though those two papers we were discussing, there's a huge variation in sort of the big picture outcomes. So, from a policy perspective, we're dealing with a hugely complex system with a lot of entropy, climatic, economic, social levels. These things are happening. So I think it's important to feel out those uncertainties and therefore focus on risk analysis as well. So not just producing a baseline view, which is why we do approach a lot of this through scenario analysis. So looking at alternative scenarios, possible downsides, possible upsides, because that gives us an understanding of the broad policy trade-offs and potential extremes of these scenarios.
Mark, do you use scenario analysis in your work with cities and regions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we take all of the scenarios that David's team produce and push them down to a city and regional level. And again, the results of both physical risk and transition risk, there's really interesting regional stories there that need to be factored into risk.
And presumably investment and policy decisions and all of anything future looking can use these scenarios?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's such a wide array of use cases for this analysis. Just understanding the scale of the task at hand I think is really important, and it's not something that's necessarily been done at a regional economic level before.
Yeah, that's really interesting. David, how might adaptation, whether it's at a city level or a country level, how might that affect our future climate pathway?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the macro approach is very much focused on sort of the impact before adaptation. So on the flip side, adaptation may help to reduce these damages, but I really see adaptation at best as a weak complement to mitigation efforts. Currently, most adaptations pretty fragmented, small in scale and sector specific, so it's really responding to current impacts or near-term risks. So it's responsive and more focused on planning than actual implementation of long-term strategies. And financing is an issue because of that specificity and responsiveness of the sort of policy environment there. So it's hard to create a business case looking into the future for a particular event to adapt to, but more broadly to coordinate action towards adaptation. And so that can make adaptation projects prone to poor adaptation or maladaptation, because you might be building the wrong things in the wrong places to respond to these kinds of things. But taking a step back, I think for me it really boils down to this. There's so much evidence for these potential tipping points and non-linearities in the damages. And to me, this suggests that without mitigation to limit the warming that leads to these non-linearities, the incremental cost of adaptation is just going to keep rising and rising as the planet continues warming. And we'll get more and more exposed to these more and more damaging climate events. So at some point you might be building a wall around the whole island, is one sort of counterexample. So more broadly, I think adaptation can play a role in limiting specific impacts, maybe in the short term, but not really as an alternative option to mitigation. So it's really at best a weak complement.
I suppose there's also a risk of, well, what we as economists call moral hazard, the idea that because these adaptation plans are in place, there's less incentive to mitigate as a risk if you go down the adaptation route. And
Absolutely.
it's such a difficult debate that I don't know where I stand on, because you can't just not prepare for the future, but you also don't want that future to eventuate, and there's two competing priorities there.
Absolutely, and I think that's why crunching the numbers is so important, because it allows us to understand what are the true potential costs and benefits of these different approaches and policies. So I think understanding the trade-offs there, both at a global level and at a region and city level, where these adaptation policies become very important to get right, responding to the particular exposures. That's where understanding the exposures and being able to produce quantitative analysis becomes extremely important.
I think quantitative analysis is what we do here at Oxford Economics, and it is extremely important. I'm going to ask you to step back from the quantitative analysis for my final question. If you had a crystal ball and you could look into that crystal ball and see what the world might look like in 10 or 20 years given climate change, what do you think that you would see? David, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think like predicting the probability of a scenario, it's also very hard to predict what to expect in such a long time horizon with much accuracy. But I can say some things about our current trajectory. I mean, there are certain themes that we're seeing. So more extreme weather events, changes in supply chains. So a reversal of globalization to some extent has started to happen, and that will impact key sectors such as food, but also supply chains with broad international coverage and exposure. We're also seeing more conflict and migration. maybe bringing this a bit more down towards the green side of things, I think on the policy side, in particular, we're going to see a lot more market change. So regulation, we're already seeing a lot of that in recent years. We're seeing this rising policy competition between the US and the EU, whether that's through investment policies or acts such as the Inflation Reduction Act, or other policies such as carbon pricing on the flip side. So going forwards, there are some negative things happening. So maybe we're going a little bit towards the climate catastrophe scenario in some ways from a physical risk perspective. We're not seeing a great state of adaptation, for example, and mitigation, there's progress, but it's not quite enough, as the recent IPCC report has mentioned. So over the next few years, probably climate catastrophe, and then probably more concerted efforts to do a transition in the 10-year horizon, maybe when these damages start to kick in. So we kind of explore that in our climate service through a delayed transition scenario. So maybe there's going to be a more last minute and therefore maybe more panicky and severe mitigation approach when people start to realize the implications of climate change, or when there's really no choice. It's the only kind of viable policy. But as I said, very, very hard to predict.
Indeed. Well, I'll turn the challenge to you now, Mark. Anything to add to that?
Well, all the things that David's just mentioned there obviously will have an impact at the regional and city level. But I think, David's probably right that we're on that path to climate catastrophe over the next 10 years, and then I think everyone will probably panic as the climate-related risks become more widespread and they start impacting places that they haven't impacted before. Then I think there'll be the policy ramp up. So in the 2030s, I'd imagine that's where we'll go. But we're already starting to see kind of some of these regional impacts of physical events kind of now. I mentioned the kind of places that are becoming uninsurable, and that's, I'd imagine, going to become more widespread, and that's when, as that happens, that's when people start to take notice. But they're the kind of the big kind of, I don't know, large scale, high intensity events, but I don't think we should underestimate kind of the more chronic impacts as well. So the changing kind of weather patterns, hot and cold waves, rainfall and snowfall, like they're all kind of changing. They're all changing now, and that has impacts on communities and small economies that are reliant on those. So both kind of agricultural, but even things like tourism. Like in Europe, you now kind of see small communities that are relying on a ski lift that have now kind of had to close, that have been operating for decades, and that's all happening because of these small kind of chronic changes over time. You don't kind of see it on the news so much because they're not the big kind of powerful hurricanes or floods, but they're all having an impact at that local level, and we shouldn't kind of forget about those events as well.
I think that's really interesting because you can, in some way, like psychologically attribute a flood or a hurricane to a freak event where, I mean, it may well be caused by climate change, but psychologically it's not so easy to link it, whereas a chronic change is clear evidence of the climate changing. So that's a really good point. I was hoping to end on an optimistic note, but I don't think we have. But I am now going to turn to my favourite part of the episode, and my guess, not so favourite part, our Greenomics gamble. So I have 3 statements about physical risks, 2 of which are true and 1 of which is false. It's up to you to pick the lie. You can work together or compete between the 2 of you, so good luck. The first statement is that in Phoenix, Arizona, there was an 80-day period this year when temperatures reached 110 Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius every single day. The second is that warmer temperatures in the south of England mean that winemakers are able to produce lots more varieties of wine and have been making some excellent sparkling wines, so champagne, look out. The third fact, or not fact, is that in Sri Lanka, water tanks built 2,400 years ago for one of the first hydrological civilizations in the world are now being repurposed in adaptation initiatives to provide water sources during droughts. So, any guesses?
They all sound pretty credible. Is it one that's true?
No, there's two that are true.
That are true. Okay.
Yeah, certainly the winemakers, I would say that's definitely true.
Good news.
Good news for us. Yeah.
I've spoken to clients that were very interested in understanding their portfolio of wineries, so I would say that's certainly, yeah.
Right, we have an expert in the room.
Yeah, I'll back you with two. I'm going to go for one as the other one, I think. Just got a hunch.
So what was that, the place in Arizona?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really hot for 80 days, was it?
Yeah. You reckon? You're going to both land on one?
Okay,
All right, well, this is somewhat a good news story then, because it was only 55 days that it remained above 43 degrees.
What a relief.
What a relief, yeah. Hot in Arizona, it turns out. So with that, all that's left to do is to say thank you to Mark and David for joining us today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
And thank you to the listeners for tuning into this episode. Next month, we'll be digging into an industry that's critical to the green transition, construction, with some of the experts from our construction service. To hear that episode, please subscribe on Spotify, SoundCloud, or on our website, and feel free to write to us at podcasts@oxfordeconomics.com. That's it for today on Greenomics from Oxford Economics, where we know that money might make the world go round, but sustainability makes it a much nicer place to live. See you next time.